My own son looked me in the eye across that dinner table and said I was just another mouth to feed. The words hit harder than a wrench to the chest. I packed my bag, stepped into that cold Atlanta night, and watched the lights of his apartment fade like the love that used to live there. My wife's old gospel hymn played in my head, soft, steady, reminding me that God wasn't done with me yet. He was waiting for me to rise again. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what would you have done if your own blood turned you away. The room smelled like old wood and rain, the kind of place where echoes stay longer than laughter. It was all I could afford after my son turned me out. A narrow bed, a single lamp with a flickering bulb, and a window that looked out over cracked pavement and a flickering streetlight. Every morning I woke up before dawn because sleep didn't comfort me anymore. It just reminded me I was alone. I'd walk to the little Baptist church down the block, sit on the back pew and listen to the choir practice through the cracked door. Their voices sounded like a promise I didn't quite believe in yet. During the day I fixed bicycles for kids in the neighborhood. Some called me Mr. E. They'd drop off busted chains, bent rims, flat tires. I never charged much. Most times I didn't charge at all. They'd leave me a soda or a slice of cornbread from their mama's kitchen, and I'd take it with a smile I didn't feel. Every spin of a wrench kept my hands busy, but it couldn't quiet my thoughts. I used to dream of my wife Rosa. Her laugh still played in my head sometimes when the wind blew through the alley just right. She'd say, "Eli, don't let the world make you bitter. It's too easy to stay mad when you could stay grateful." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't find gratitude in the echo of my son's voice calling me a burden. On Sundays, I still wore my best jacket. I ironed it crisp, shined my shoes, and walked to service. Families filled the pews, all pressed and smiling. The scent of perfume and fried chicken clung to the air. The pastor talked about forgiveness, about grace. I nodded, but the words slid off me like rain on glass. When service ended, I waited for people to leave before I did. That way, no one had to make small talk with the man who sat alone. Sometimes the neighborhood boys stayed behind to help me lock up the small gate outside my building. They'd ask about my life before, about my son, about the woman in the photo frame I kept on the counter. I'd just say, "She's home now," and they'd nod like they understood. But they didn't. How could they? They hadn't lost everything yet. Nights were the worst. The building creaked like it was alive, and every noise sounded like footsteps from a ghost I didn't want to meet. I'd sit by the window, sip weak coffee, and watch the city breathe flashing lights, sirens in the distance. Laughter from somewhere far enough away, it didn't sound real. My phone stayed silent, a dark rectangle on the table. I checked it anyway, hoping for a message from Darius. Nothing. The first winter rain hit hard that year. The pipes hissed, and cold air leaked through the gaps in the window frame. I wrapped myself in an old quilt Rosa had made from her choir robes, deep purple and white patches sewn together with love and patience. I used to joke that her stitching could hold the world together. Now it barely held me. One evening, Pastor Green stopped by after service. He was a stout man with kind eyes and a voice that could shake the walls when he prayed. He said he'd seen me sitting alone too many Sundays and thought maybe I could use some company. We drank instant coffee that tasted like cardboard, but he stayed for hours. We talked about work, about faith, about the kind of pain that doesn't leave bruises. Before he left, he said, "Brother Elijah, the Lord don't waste suffering. He recycles it into strength." I wanted to believe that, but strength felt like a foreign language to me. I started volunteering at the church during the week, sweeping floors, fixing pews, tightening loose screws on the old organ bench. No one asked why I was there so often. Maybe they knew. Maybe they just let me heal in silence. On Fridays, the youth choir practiced late. I'd sit in the back and listen. Their harmonies filled the room, and for a few minutes I forgot about the cold, the loneliness, the apartment I used to call home. But when the singing stopped, it all came rushing back. I'd walk home under the streetlights, shoes clicking on wet pavement, my breath fogging in the air. I'd see families through their windows, kids doing homework, couples arguing, people living. It was like watching life from the outside of a glass wall I couldn't break. Then one night something shifted. A boy named Marcus brought me his bike, a rusted blue Schwinn that looked older than him. His mom had passed the year before, and his father worked nights. He said he wanted to ride to church on Sundays, but the tires wouldn't hold air. I told him I'd fix it for free. When I handed it back, his eyes lit up like sunrise. He said, "You're a good man, Mr. E. My mom used to say, 'God don't forget folks like you.'" That hit deep. Maybe God hadn't forgotten me after all. Maybe he was just waiting for me to remember myself. I walked back to my room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and looked at Rosa's picture. The shame I'd been carrying started to loosen its grip. My son could call me a burden, the world could forget my name, but I still had purpose. Still, the nights stayed long. I prayed not for Darius to come back, but for peace, for clarity, for a reason to keep waking up. The next morning I found one. A letter slipped under my door, yellowed and folded in half. The return address was from an old name I hadn't seen in decades. Deacon Harold Simmons. The man who once promised me he'd take care of Rosa if anything ever happened. My hands trembled as I opened it, reading words that would turn my quiet grief into something else entirely. I didn't know it yet, but that letter would change everything. The Bible was still covered in a fine layer of dust when I opened it. Rosa's handwriting was faint on the inside cover. "To my Elijah, keep your faith when it feels furthest away." I'd read those words so many times they had become part of me. But that afternoon, as sunlight cut through the blinds and laid stripes across the worn leather, something slipped loose from between the pages. A folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, tucked behind Psalm 27. My heart stuttered. Rosa never hid anything from me. She wasn't a secret-keeping woman. She believed truth was holy. My fingers trembled as I opened it, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The handwriting wasn't hers. The bold, looping script belonged to someone else, someone from another lifetime. Deacon Harold Simmons. The name alone carried history. Back when I was still a young man with grease-stained hands and a dream of opening my own auto shop, Harold had been one of the first to lend me money from the church's small business fund. He was more than a friend. He was a man of faith in numbers, someone who could pray and profit in the same breath without losing himself. The letter was dated 12 years ago, just a year before Rosa passed. I read it once, then again. The words didn't change. Rosa had met with Harold to set up a private trust. Not just a savings account, but a real estate investment fund in my name. Property in my old neighborhood, dividends, reinvested value, compounding quietly for more than a decade. The numbers made my chest tighten. I wasn't a rich man, not by a long shot, but this was something else. More than I could have built in 2 lifetimes. Harold's final line struck me hardest. She wanted you to live, not just survive. I sat back, the letter trembling in my hand. My first thought wasn't money. It was Rosa's face, the way she'd smile without moving her lips, the way she'd hum old gospel tunes while paying bills at the kitchen table. She must have known I wouldn't accept help while she was alive. Pride had always been my sin. So she'd planned this quietly, trusting time and grace to deliver it when I was ready. And maybe I finally was. That night I couldn't sleep. The city hummed outside, but my room felt too small to hold what I'd found. I kept seeing Rosa in the doorway, her hand on her hip, her voice soft but firm. "Elijah, you can fix anything, but some things you just got to let God handle." Maybe this was God handling it. I found Harold's number on the letterhead, though I doubted it still worked. My thumb hovered over the digits, then I dialed anyway. It rang once, twice, and then a deep, familiar voice answered. "This is Harold." The years hadn't changed his tone, still steady, still carrying that quiet authority. When I told him who it was, there was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be. Elijah Carter. I was wondering when that letter would find you." We met the next day at a small diner on Auburn Avenue, the kind that still smelled like bacon grease and old gospel vinyl. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were sharp. He ordered coffee for both of us before I could speak. "She came to me after her last hospital visit," he said. "Said she didn't want to burden you with more worry. She knew you'd be proud, so she asked me to make sure it stayed quiet until the time was right. I leaned forward. What do you mean the time was right? He smiled faintly. Until life made you humble enough to use what she left instead of hiding from it. The words stung, but they were true. He slid a folder across the table, document signatures, the full breakdown. She'd left me more than property. She'd left me control. Multiple units. Good neighborhoods, all paid off. It's all yours, Eli. Been yours. You just had to open that Bible. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't about the money. It was the fact that she'd seen my downfall coming before I ever hit the ground. She knew Darius. She knew the distance that would grow. Maybe that's why she'd prepared something that couldn't be taken, something that waited for me on the other side of betrayal. I thanked Harold, but the words felt too small. He gripped my shoulder and said, "Don't waste it on resentment. Build something. Make her proud." Then he left me with the check, a quiet gesture that made me laugh despite myself. I walked back to my small room with the folder pressed against my chest like it was part of me. I sat by the window, spread the papers out on the table, and read until the ink blurred from my tired eyes. For the first time in months, my chest didn't ache. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt seen. Rosa had built a bridge for me to walk back into the world, and I planned to cross it. Over the next few days, I called the attorney listed on the paperwork. Mr. Golding, a patient man with a voice smooth as polished wood, confirmed everything. The trust had matured. The properties were under my control. He offered to meet to help transfer ownership formally. I met him in his downtown office, a space filled with glass and the smell of expensive cologne. He explained how Rosa had used her inheritance from her aunt money. I never knew she had to buy those first 2 buildings. She believed in community investment, he said. Wanted to keep families together, especially yours. That sentence stuck. Especially yours. My son and his wife were still living in one of those neighborhoods, though they'd traded compassion for convenience long ago. I signed every document Mr. Golding handed me, the sound of pen on paper crisp and final. When it was done, he smiled and said, "You've got more power than you realize, Mr. Carter. What do you plan to do with it?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out his window at the city stretching far beyond the glass. The same streets where I'd once worked, once built something from nothing, once raised a family. Now I owned a piece of it again. But I wasn't thinking about revenge, not yet. I was thinking about Rosa's letter, her faith, her quiet wisdom. She'd wanted me to live. Maybe living meant reclaiming what was mine without bitterness, standing tall without noise. That night I went back to the church. The choir was rehearsing again. I sat in the same back pew, but this time I didn't feel small. The pastor saw me, nodded once as if he could tell something had shifted. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer I hadn't prayed since Rosa's funeral. Thank you for not forgetting me. When I walked out, the night air felt different, cooler, cleaner, alive. My heart was steady. My hands no longer shook. I looked up at the stars and thought of her voice saying, "You can fix anything, Eli." She was right. Maybe now it was time to fix everything. I didn't know it then, but that discovery wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more satisfying. Mr. Golding's office smelled like cedar and quiet money. Everything in there had weight. His fountain pen, the thick papers stacked on his desk, even the way he said my name. He wore a gray suit that fit like good manners and kept his glasses low on his nose as he explained every clause, every signature Rosa had left behind. I listened, nodding, my hands folded, to keep them from shaking. When he finished, he slid the last page toward me and said, "Mr. Carter, this is the kind of inheritance that changes a man's life." I looked down at the neat black ink of her signature beside mine. "It already did," I said. When I stepped outside, Atlanta's heat hit me like a sermon. The air buzzed with cicadas and traffic roared like an old hymn turned angry. I walked past glass towers and construction sites, past everything that looked like progress but felt like distance. Rosa's letter was still in my pocket. It pressed against my chest like a heartbeat I hadn't earned. I didn't go home. My feet carried me to the church without thinking. The lights were dim, but the doors were open. They were always open. I walked down that long aisle, the wood creaking under my boots, and stopped at the altar. No choir, no congregation, just me and the echoes of every prayer I'd ever whispered into silence. I knelt there, the air cool and still, and for the first time since Rosa's funeral I spoke out loud. "I know what this is," I said. "You didn't forget me. You just waited till I remembered myself." I don't know how long I stayed there, but when I rose, my knees ached and my heart felt lighter. The world outside hadn't changed, but something in me had. I wasn't a broken old man waiting for pity anymore. I was a man standing at the edge of a second chance. I walked home slow that night, the streets shimmering under the yellow glow of streetlights. Every sound felt sharper, the hum of power lines, the murmur of neighbors sitting on porches, a baby crying somewhere in the distance. The world was moving, and I was ready to move with it again. The next morning I called the bank, the property manager the accountant Harold recommended. I listened, took notes, asked questions like I'd been born for it. The numbers didn't scare me anymore. They were tools, hammers, and nails for rebuilding the life Rosa had planned for me. When I visited the buildings she'd bought, I expected luxury. What I found instead were cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, and tenants who looked at me like I was another bill collector. But the truth was, I saw myself in them. Working folks, church folks, people who'd built small lives and guarded them like gold. Rosa hadn't invested in property. She'd invested in people like us. That realization cut deeper than pride ever could. It wasn't revenge she'd given me. It was redemption. I started spending my mornings at the first building on the corner of Auburn and Jackson, talking to tenants, checking on leaks, helping fix door hinges. Some of them didn't believe I was the new owner. "You don't look like no landlord," one woman said, her baby on her hip. I smiled. Maybe that's the point. By evening, word spread. Folks started nodding when they saw me tipping their hats, offering sweet tea through screen doors. It felt like family again, the kind I'd lost but somehow found in strangers. Still, every night when the city went quiet, my thoughts drifted to Darius. I'd see his face in the glow of the TV through someone's window, or hear his laugh echo from memory. The anger that used to rise in me was gone, replaced by something colder, steadier. Pity maybe, or clarity. I wasn't going to chase him down or beg for recognition. I wasn't going to throw money in his face just to prove I'd survived. No, my victory would be quiet. It would be built brick by brick with the same patience Rosa had shown all her life. One Friday I went back to the church. The choir was rehearsing a slow gospel tune that wrapped around the room like honey. Pastor Green saw me in the back and walked over after the last note faded. "You look lighter," he said. "I'm not carrying what ain't mine anymore," I told him. He smiled, tapping his Bible. "That's the spirit of a man who's found peace." Peace. That word had always sounded like surrender to me. But standing there in that half-empty sanctuary, I realized peace didn't mean giving up. It meant choosing not to fight battles that had already been won. Over the next few weeks, I made plans, real plans, renovations, investments, ways to keep those buildings alive. I hired local crews, gave jobs to young men who'd been hanging around corners too long. When they asked why I cared, I just said, because somebody cared for me when I didn't deserve it. Each day felt like laying a new foundation. But somewhere deep inside, a question kept whispering, what happens when Darius finds out? What happens when he learns that the old man he threw out now owns the ground beneath his feet? I didn't have an answer yet. Maybe it wasn't time for one. Maybe part of the lesson was patience, the same kind Rosa had when she planned all this. I knew she wouldn't want me acting out of spite, but she also wouldn't want me to stay quiet forever. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, I stood on the rooftop of one of the buildings. The air smelled like summer storms and asphalt. From up there, the world looked wide again. I could see the church steeple glinting in the distance, the freeway stretching out like a promise. I pulled Rosa's letter from my pocket. The paper had softened from being unfolded so many times the ink slightly faded. I read the last line again. Live, not just survive. I closed my eyes and said, "I'm trying, baby. I'm really trying." Somewhere below, a car horn blared, a baby cried, laughter spilled out of a window. Life, messy and beautiful, kept moving. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into my pocket. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The man who once walked away from his own home with a suitcase in shame was gone. In his place stood someone patient, watchful, and unshakable. I didn't need to shout my strength. The world would feel it soon enough. And when it did, it wouldn't come in anger, it would come in silence. The kind of silence that makes people realize too late that they underestimated the wrong man. The first time I saw that building again, I almost turned the car around. It looked smaller than I remembered, less like a home and more like a scar on the street. The brick was chipped, the paint faded, and yet I could still see the window where my son once stood, telling me I was an extra mouth to feed. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, listening to the hum of the engine and the rain tapping against the windshield. My hands didn't shake this time. I'd come back not as a father begging for space, but as the man who now owned every brick, every window, every inch of ground beneath it. It took weeks to close the deal, but no one knew my name. I set up a company under the initials E.C. Holdings kept my face off the paperwork and let the lawyers handle the noise. The former landlord didn't ask questions. He was too eager to sell. When the ink dried, the papers came back to me in a crisp envelope. I opened it alone in my small room, the same one where I once counted every dollar I had left. Now the deed to that building lay in my hands. It was a strange kind of quiet power, cold, clean, and final. I didn't celebrate. I went for a walk instead. The city felt different when you owned a piece of it. The streetlights seemed to burn a little brighter, the air a little lighter. But power, I learned, only mattered if you used it right. I wasn't there to destroy my son's life. I was there to remind him whose shoulders he stood on before he forgot what that meant. The next morning I called the property manager, a sharp young woman named Renee. She didn't know me, and I liked it that way. I told her I wanted renovations done, fresh paint, new security lights, plumbing fixed, and the courtyard cleaned up. She asked about the rent adjustments. I told her to be fair to everyone. Then I paused. "Except for Unit 2B, I said. "That one goes up threefold." There was silence on the line. "Threefold, sir? That's a big jump. They might move out." "That's their choice," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But if they stay, they'll pay what living there's worth." I could almost hear her typing, processing my request. "Understood, Mr. Carter," she said finally. Hearing my name from someone who didn't know its history felt strange, almost cleansing. Over the next few weeks, the transformation began. Workers stripped the old building bare and gave it new skin, fresh white paint, polished railings, trimmed hedges. The smell of sawdust and fresh plaster filled the air. I'd stop by quietly dressed in a plain work jacket, pretending to check on supplies. No one recognized me. Not the tenants, not the maintenance crew, and certainly not my son. I saw him once from across the street carrying groceries with Tiffany at his side. She wore that same superior look, the one that used to make my stomach twist. But this time I felt nothing, just distance. Word spread fast among the tenants about the new owner. Some said he was an investor from Texas. Others thought it was a corporation from Florida. No one guessed it was the old man they'd seen fixing bikes near the church. I watched as people started taking pride in the place again. Kids playing in a clean courtyard, neighbors sweeping their steps, music playing softly from open windows. Then came the notice day. Renee sent out the new rent letters, all neatly typed and sealed. I didn't have to imagine the sound Tiffany made when she opened theirs. I'd heard that tone before, sharp and offended, like life itself had betrayed her. Darius called the management office within the hour, furious. He demanded to speak to the owner. Renee told him she'd pass along the message. She did. I ignored it. That night I sat on my porch, the city breeze brushing against my face, sipping coffee gone cold. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even satisfied. I was still waiting for something, maybe understanding, maybe peace. I thought about Rosa again, how she'd shake her head and say, Don't let pride steal your blessing. Maybe this wasn't pride. Maybe it was justice dressed in quiet clothes. A few days later, I got a call from Renee again. "Sir," she said, "the tenants from 2B came by today. They said the increase isn't fair. They want to know if the owner could reconsider." I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, like she'd been caught between two storms. "You can tell them," I said slowly, "that fairness depends on perspective, and mine has changed." She hesitated. "I'll tell them, Mr. Carter." The next week they started packing boxes. I watched from the corner of the block, half hidden behind a parked truck. Tiffany barked orders while Darius kept his head down. For a brief second he looked up and scanned the street. Our eyes almost met. Almost. But he looked away too fast. Pride again. Always pride. When their car pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I didn't move. I stood there until the taillights disappeared into the traffic. The building behind me glowed under the afternoon sun, clean, alive, and mine. For the first time in years I felt steady. But that feeling didn't last long. One of the tenants, an old woman named Miss Geneva, came down the steps and waved at me. "You the new owner?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled, her eyes kind and sharp. "I don't know what kind of man buys a place like this and fixes it up for strangers, but the Lord must have sent you." Her words hit me deep. I wasn't doing it for the Lord. Not yet. But maybe in some twisted way he was using me anyway. That night I walked through the building alone. The new lights hummed softly in the halls. I ran my hand along the freshly painted walls, feeling the smooth surface under my fingers. The echoes of that night when I'd been thrown out came back faintly, the slammed door, the silence afterward. But this time I didn't feel the sting. Just closure. I stopped outside what used to be Darius's apartment. The door was still there, same number, same brass handle. I thought about knocking, even though it was empty now. But instead I whispered to the air, "You'll learn one day, son. Not every burden is meant to break you." I walked away before the weight of that truth could pull me down. Outside the street was quiet. My reflection glimmered in the window of the corner store across the road, an old man with silver hair standing tall under the streetlight. For the first time in a long time I didn't see the outcast. I saw the owner. But what I didn't know yet was that ownership would come with a price of its own, and soon enough I'd find out just how high that price could be. I saw the lights first, those same yellow windows that once slammed shut in my face. They glowed through the drizzle like weak candles, trembling desperate. From the street I could hear muffled voices rising and falling. A woman's sharp tones slicing through the air, followed by the dull thud of something hitting the floor. Tiffany's voice. I didn't need to imagine the rest. Darius had always been slow to anger, but he never knew how to fight without raising his voice. Now the two of them were learning what silence costs when it turns into debt. I parked across the street and killed the engine. The rain tapped against the windshield like a metronome, keeping time with the shouting upstairs. The building looked different now, cleaner, steadier, full of life. But that unit, their unit, felt like a wound that refused to heal. I could have looked away, but I didn't. I watched the shadow of my son move past the curtains, shoulders tense, head bowed. He wasn't the man he thought he was anymore. Pride had stripped him bare. Word spread fast in places like that. Neighbors leaning over balconies, whispering between laundry lines. "That's karma," one woman said loud enough for me to hear. Another laughed softly. "Couldn't happen to better folks. It was cruel, but the truth always sounds cruel to the guilty." I didn't stay long. Watching their world crumble wasn't satisfaction, it was confirmation. Proof that some lessons can't be taught with words. I started the engine, rolled past the curb, and took one last look at the apartment where my own son had once told me to leave. The window blinds fluttered in the wind like an old flag surrendering. Driving through the city that night, I passed the familiar corners of my past. The auto shop where I'd once worked still stood there, half closed, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat refusing to quit. The corner store where Rosa and I used to buy peach sodas after Sunday service was now a coffee chain. The city had moved on, But I hadn't. Not until now. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older than I felt, lines deeper, eyes sharper. I thought about what Pastor Green had said about letting the Lord handle your enemies. Maybe this was what that looked like. No shouting, no revenge, no triumph, just truth unfolding on its own time. The next morning, Renee called me. Her voice carried that careful tone people use when they're trying to hide bad news. "Mr. Carter, Unit 2B missed the payment deadline," she said. "They're asking for an extension." "How long?" I asked. "They said a month." She mentioned they're looking for a new place. I waited a beat before answering. "Tell them the grace period is 1 week. After that, business is business." I heard her exhale quietly, then a pause. Understood. When she hung up, I sat in silence. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even proud. Just steady. The same way my hands used to be when I worked under the hood of a car, measured, deliberate, knowing one wrong move could break something that didn't need to be broken. A few days later, I drove by again. Their blinds were closed tight now. No laughter, no lights. Just the hum of a box fan from inside. The other tenants seemed lighter, happier even. Kids playing in the courtyard again, someone grilling on the stoop. I walked by, unnoticed the landlord, who didn't look like one, just another old man with stories no one asked to hear. By the end of the week, Renee called again. "They're gone," she said. "Left in the middle of the night. Didn't even leave a forwarding address." "Any damage?" "None. Just emptiness." That word lingered. Emptiness. After we hung up, I went to the building. The rain had cleared, and the late afternoon sun hit the walls with a kind of forgiveness. I climbed the stairs to Unit 2B and unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, faintly smelling of perfume and cheap air freshener. The walls were bare except for one nail still holding the outline of where a picture had hung. I stood there for a while, trying to remember the sound of their laughter from before everything broke. I couldn't. I turned off the lights, closed the door, and left the key on the counter. Outside, Miss Geneva spotted me. "They finally gone?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She nodded, rocking slightly on her porch chair. "Lord works in mysterious ways." I smiled faintly. "Sometimes not that mysterious." She chuckled, and I walked away before she could see the tears sitting just behind my eyes. That night I drove out to the lake on the edge of the city, the place Rosa and I used to go when we needed quiet. The water was dark, still endless. I rolled down the window and let the air rush in. Somewhere between the sound of the waves and the rustling trees, I heard her voice in my mind. "You can fix anything, Eli. Just don't forget to fix yourself." Maybe I'd done that. Or maybe I was still trying. I stayed there until the moon rose high, the reflection trembling across the water like silver glass. My phone buzzed once Renee again. "Just wanted you to know," she said softly, "you did good, Mr. Carter. The building feels different now, like it's breathing again." I thanked her, then hung up. I sat there a while longer, hands resting on the steering wheel, the smell of rain and old wood filling the car. When I finally turned the key, the engine hummed steady low, like a prayer answered without words. I didn't look back at the water. I didn't need to. The past was behind me, quiet and still. But as I drove toward the city lights, a thought slipped in a whisper I couldn't ignore. What happens when peace feels too quiet? When justice comes so softly it leaves room for something else to grow in its place. I didn't know then, but that silence was just the calm before the next storm. The air inside the community room was heavy with the smell of fresh paint and old secrets. Folding chairs scraped against the tile floor as tenants shuffled in whispering about the new owner who had bought the place and changed everything. I sat near the back, silent in a dark tailored suit that fit tighter than my conscience. My hands rested on the cane. I didn't really need my hat tilted low enough to hide my eyes. The hum of conversation was steady, full of curiosity and speculation. No one had any idea that the man they were waiting to meet was sitting among them. Renee stood at the front with her clipboard, looking sharp as always, the model of professionalism. She smiled, cleared her throat, and started the meeting. Thank you all for coming. As you know, EC Holdings has been making major improvements to the property. Tonight, the new owner wanted to meet you personally. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Around me, tenants murmured, some grateful, some skeptical. The improvements had drawn attention: better lighting, secure locks, repaired roofs. To them, the owner was just another name on a piece of mail. But for me, this wasn't business. It was Judgment Day. The door creaked open behind me. Late arrivals. I didn't need to turn to know who they were. Tiffany's perfume, sweet and artificial, hit me before her voice did. "Excuse us," she said, sliding past chairs. Darius followed, his shoulders tight, his jaw set. He looked older, thinner, carrying the kind of weight no gym could train you for. They found 2 empty seats near the front, my son sitting there unaware that the man he'd once called a burden was breathing the same air. Renee smiled at them politely, then continued, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man responsible for everything you've seen, the one who believed this community could be more than what it was, Mr. Elijah Carter." For a heartbeat, the room didn't move. Then heads turned. All of them. I stood slowly, the scrape of my chair loud in the stillness. My hat stayed low until I reached the center of the room. Then I lifted it off. Every sound died. The buzzing fluorescent light above us felt deafening. Darius froze, his eyes widening like he was seeing a ghost. Tiffany's hand went to her mouth. She whispered something, but her voice cracked halfway through. I looked straight at my son, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one looking up. "My name's Elijah Carter," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm the man you said was just another mouth to feed." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. Darius's face drained of color. Tiffany's gaze dropped to the floor, her polished composure shattering like thin glass. A few tenants exchanged glances, some whispering under their breath. Others just stared at me with the kind of respect you can't buy. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. I bought this building because I believe in second chances, not just for me but for the people who live here. I've seen too many good folks forgotten. That ends now. Every word landed heavy. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger is loud, but justice, real justice, is quiet. I turned toward Darius. His eyes were wet, his lips trembling like he was searching for an apology that didn't exist yet. "Dad?" He started, but his voice failed him. I raised a hand to stop him. "You don't owe me words, son. You owe yourself honesty." Tiffany looked like she wanted to disappear. Her perfect hair, her diamond earrings, they meant nothing under those lights. "We didn't know," she muttered. I looked at her briefly. "You did," I said softly. "You just didn't care." The room stayed still, the air thick enough to taste. Behind me, a few of the older tenants nodded, their faces filled with quiet approval. They knew what it meant for a man to stand tall after being knocked down. Renee broke the silence, her voice careful. "Mr. Carter has plans to continue improving the property. We're proud to have him lead this community." I nodded to her, then turned back to the crowd. "This place," I said, "isn't just brick and wood. It's about people. Respect. Dignity. You treat folks right, you'll never have to fear a knock on your door." The words weren't for them, they were for him. My son sat there, eyes fixed on the floor, hands clenched. I wanted to reach out, but I couldn't. Not yet. Some lessons had to finish burning before they could teach anything. When the meeting ended, people gathered around, shaking my hand, thanking me. I smiled, nodded, but my eyes never left Darius. He didn't move. Tiffany whispered something to him, but he stayed frozen, staring at the ground like it might open up and swallow him whole. As the crowd thinned, I walked toward the exit. The night air hit me like freedom. Behind me, footsteps followed, hesitant, slow. "Dad?" he said softly. I stopped but didn't turn. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "About everything." I looked over my shoulder. The boy I'd raised was gone. In his place stood a man stripped bare by consequence. "Son," I said, my voice low, "wrong is fine. Staying wrong, that's the sin." He nodded, eyes glistening under the flickering hallway light. I wanted to tell him I forgave him right there. I wanted to say that no matter what, he was still my blood. But the words stuck in my throat. Not yet. Forgiveness isn't a gift, it's a process. I left him standing there, the echo of his apology still hanging between us like smoke after a fire. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, but somewhere beyond them I knew the stars were still shining. I loosened my tie, took a long breath, and let the night wrap around me. The truth had walked into that room, and for the first time it didn't need to shout. It just stood there, wearing my face, my silence, and my suit. But I knew that night wasn't the end. The truth has a way of uncovering more than you expect, and mine was about to reveal something I wasn't ready for. He showed up just after sunset, standing on my porch like a man who'd forgotten how to knock. The porch light threw a yellow circle around him, highlighting the wrinkles worry had carved into his face. For a moment I thought about pretending not to see him, just letting him stand there in the silence he'd earned. But something in his posture stopped me. Shoulders slumped, head low, hands twisting the brim of his cap like it was a confession. He looked smaller than I remembered, not because he'd shrunk, but because life had finally stripped the pride off him. I opened the door. Neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, full of things that had never been said, and things that had been said too loud. He looked past me into the small living room, the worn couch, the Bible on the coffee table, the photo of Rosa smiling from her frame. His eyes lingered there a little too long. "You gonna let me in, Pop?" he asked quietly. "Door's open," I said, stepping aside. He walked in slow, like a man entering church for the first time in years. The house smelled like lemon oil and fried catfish from lunch. He sat down on the edge of the couch, careful not to lean back like he didn't deserve to rest there. I went to the kitchen and filled 2 glasses with sweet tea, the way Rosa used to make it, strong, dark, just enough sugar to hide the bitterness. When I came back, he was staring at the photo again. "She'd be disappointed in me," he said. I set the glasses down. "She'd still pray for you," I replied. He nodded, eyes fixed on his hands. "I lost the job," he said finally. They cut back at the firm. "Tiffany? She left last month. Said she was tired of struggling. Took most of what we had left." I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is the only truth strong enough to stand on its own. He took a breath, his voice cracking around the edges. "I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I was better than you. And the whole time I was just building my life on sand." His eyes finally met mine. "I forgot who raised me, Pop." The words hung there fragile and raw. I saw the boy he used to be hiding behind the man he'd become. I wanted to tell him I'd been waiting to hear that for years, but I didn't. I just handed him a glass of tea. "You didn't forget me," I said. "You forgot how to pray. But it's never too late to start again." He swallowed hard, staring into his glass. His hands trembled slightly before he took a sip. "I don't even know how anymore." "Start by being honest," I said. "That's all prayer really is. Telling the truth when nobody else is listening." He nodded slowly. A tear slid down his cheek, tracing the path of all the years he'd spent pretending he didn't care. He tried to hide it, but I saw it. I'd seen that same tear on my own face once in the reflection of a hospital window the night Rosa passed. For a long time we just sat there. No shouting, no anger, just 2 men sharing silence like a truce. The ice clinked in our glasses, and the clock on the wall ticked steady. Outside, the cicadas hummed like they were filling in the words we couldn't find. After a while, he spoke again, softer this time. "You knew, didn't you? About the building. About everything." "I did." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you weren't ready to listen," I said. "And I wasn't ready to talk." He laughed bitterly. "Guess we both learned the hard way. Hard lessons are the only ones that last," I told him. He leaned back, finally exhaling the kind of breath a man holds for years without realizing it. His eyes wandered around the room, the old armchair, the framed picture of me and Rosa at the lake, the cross above the door. "This place feels like her," he said quietly. "She never left," I said. "She just changed address." That made him smile, a small broken thing, but real enough to count. After a while, he asked if he could pray. It startled me. I hadn't heard him say those words since he was a boy standing beside me in church with his small hand gripping mine. He bowed his head awkward at first, stumbling through the sentences like someone trying to remember lyrics to a song long forgotten. But by the end, his voice steadied. He asked for forgiveness, for strength, for a second chance to be the kind of man his mother believed he could be. When he finished, I said, "Amen," and the room felt lighter. He looked at me, eyes red face streaked with salt. "You really forgive me, Pop?" I thought about it. Forgiveness isn't simple. It's not a key that unlocks the past. It's a door you have to build yourself. "I'm working on it," I said. "But I don't hate you. That's a start." He nodded, his shoulders shaking once before he steadied himself. "I don't deserve your grace." "You don't," I said plainly. But neither did I. And I still got it. We finished our tea in silence. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, bathing the room in a soft amber glow. The world felt smaller, closer, almost kind. He stood to leave, hesitating at the door. "If you ever need anything, Pop," he said, "anything at all." I smiled faintly. "I'll keep that in mind, son." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the path. I watched him until he disappeared into the dark. The night air smelled like rain and redemption. I turned off the lights, sat back down, and looked at Rosa's picture one more time. "You'd be proud," I whispered. "He's finding his way home." For the first time in years, I felt something loosen inside me. The bitterness that had lived in my chest finally began to fade. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about setting him free. It was about setting myself free too. But as I closed my eyes, a quiet thought crept in, uninvited and sharp. Peace never stays still for long. And sometimes when you've lived through enough storms, you learn that calm can be just another warning before the next one hits. The morning I signed the check, the sky over Atlanta was the same shade of gray as the paper in front of me, dull, honest, and heavy with memory. The ink hadn't even dried when I realized this was the first time in years my hand didn't tremble. I wrote out the amount, more than I'd ever dreamed of giving away, and slid it across the pastor's desk without a word. He looked down at the number, then back up at me, eyes wide behind his glasses. "Brother Elijah," he said softly. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I told him. "Half of what I have, Pastor. The rest will take care of itself." He stared at me like I'd just confessed a secret instead of a gift. Outside, the church bells rang noon, their sound rolling through the streets like an old hymn with a new verse. For a long time he didn't speak. Then he reached across the table, laid his hand over mine, and said, "You're proof that faith and wisdom beat revenge every time." I wanted to tell him it wasn't faith or wisdom that brought me here. It was exhaustion. You carry anger long enough, and one day you wake up realizing it's heavier than the sin that caused it. I didn't want to die bitter. Rosa wouldn't have wanted that either. The money went to the Ruth and James Fellowship Home, a small shelter behind the church where old folks with nowhere to go could find a bed, a meal, and somebody to call their name. It was the kind of place most people passed without noticing, a brick building with fading blue shutters and a cross out front that leaned slightly to the right. I'd walked by it 100 times, never thinking much of it. Now it would carry my late wife's legacy, her quiet compassion wrapped in concrete and kindness. The first time I visited after the renovations, the smell of cornbread and disinfectant hit me as soon as I stepped inside. The floors gleamed, the walls were freshly painted, and the sound of laughter, old broken laughter, echoed down the halls. A woman named Miss Carroll greeted me at the door. "You, Mr. Carter?" she asked, smiling wide. "They told me you're the reason we got a new stove. That old thing we had kept cutting off mid-supper." I chuckled. "Well, ma'am, I know what it's like to have your heat give out when you need it most." She led me through the building, introducing me to residence folks who'd been forgotten by time and family alike. One man, a retired bus driver named Leon, shook my hand and said, "You don't know what this means. Thought I'd be spending my last days on a park bench. Now I get to watch the sunrise through a real window again." I smiled, but something caught in my throat. I thought of all the nights I'd stared out a window in that tiny rented room wondering if God was still listening. Maybe this was his answer, late but perfect in timing. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected. People started showing up at the church wanting to volunteer, donate, or just help paint a wall. The local paper ran a story about the mystery benefactor, but when the pastor finally told them my name, the headline changed. Elijah Carter, the man who turned pain into purpose. I didn't care for the attention, but I couldn't deny it felt good to see something born of loss turn into hope. A week later, during Sunday service, the pastor called me up to the front. The sanctuary was full, every pew taken. The choir dressed in deep gold robes that shimmered under the light. I tried to wave him off, but he insisted. "This man," he said, voice booming through the microphone, "reminds us all that the best revenge isn't anger or pride, it's grace." The congregation stood and clapped. I could see faces from all corners of my story, neighbors, church members, even a few of the tenants from my building. In the back near the door, Darius stood with his hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. Our eyes met across the crowd, and for the first time there was no guilt between us, just understanding. After service, he came up to me quietly. "I heard what you did," he said. "Mom would have loved that place." "She already does," I told him. "She's there in every smile that walks through that door." He nodded, the faintest smile touching his lips. "You think they'd let me help out?" I studied him for a moment. "They'll need strong hands. You got those from me. The heart. You'll have to rebuild that yourself." He laughed softly. "Fair enough, Pop." In the weeks that followed, we both started spending more time at the fellowship home. He painted walls, fixed leaky pipes, even drove a van to pick up supplies. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. We didn't need to. Forgiveness isn't a sentence. It's a rhythm, one you find when you stop trying to force the melody. One evening, I found myself in the kitchen helping Miss Carol stir a pot of soup. "You're a good man, Mr. Carter," she said. "Not many folks your age still do the Lord's work with both hands." I smiled. I spent too many years using them for anger. Time I gave them back to something that lasts. When the pot was done, we carried it out together. The room filled with laughter, the kind that comes from people who've known loss but choose to live anyway. I looked around at the faces lined with time, glowing with peace, and felt something inside me settle for the first time in decades. Later that night, as I locked up the building, I stood under the porch light and watched the neighborhood breathe. The hum of traffic, the faint rhythm of gospel music drifting from a nearby house. It all felt like a hymn written just for me. I thought about Rosa again, her soft voice in my ear. "You can fix anything, Eli, if you just start with love." Maybe that was what this all had been about. Not vengeance, not justice, but repair. As I walked home under the slow, forgiving sky, I realized something simple but true. Life doesn't hand you redemption wrapped in gold. It gives you a hammer, a nail, and a second chance to build something better. And while the world was finally quiet around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the silence ahead, one more test was waiting, one last lesson about what grace really costs. The sky that evening looked like it had been painted by tired hands, gold melting into rust, fading into blue. I sat on my porch, the wood warm beneath my palms, the hum of cicadas rising like a choir just out of rhythm. The air smelled faintly of rain and magnolia. In moments like that, the world felt soft again, like it was finally giving me permission to rest. I leaned back in my chair and started humming that old blues tune Rosa used to love. She used to sway to it while cooking, her shoulders moving to a rhythm that only her heart could hear. The memory rolled through me slow and steady, like whiskey warming the chest. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't angry. The bitterness that once sat heavy in my bones had drained out of me, replaced by something quieter, something that felt a lot like peace. The ghosts in my chest had stopped shouting. I realized I didn't need revenge anymore, not when life had already done its own reckoning. Everything I'd lost had found its way back to me in a different form. Respect, dignity, a son learning to kneel again, and maybe that was enough. Darius came by earlier that day. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He stood by the porch rail, his shadow long in the evening light, and handed me a small wooden box. "For you," he said. Inside was a photo of Rosa I hadn't seen before her at the church picnic, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. He'd found it tucked in an old album while cleaning out what used to be their apartment. "She'd want you to have it," he said. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer, so I just nodded. When he left, he hugged me, really. Hugged me like a man who finally understood what his arms were made for. I watched him walk down the path, his stride slower, his head clearer. Maybe forgiveness had loosened something in both of us. Maybe it always works that way, two locks turning with the same key. Now as the sun bled into the horizon, I could almost hear Rosa's voice in the wind. "You did good, Eli," she'd whisper. "You kept your faith when it was hardest to hold." I smiled at that because maybe I hadn't kept my faith perfectly, but I'd kept it alive, even when life tried to bury it. The neighborhood was quiet except for the laughter of kids down the block and the distant hum of a train cutting through the city. I watched the light fade from the rooftops, painting everything in soft amber. The world had a way of keeping time, even when I forgot how. I thought about the shelter, about the faces I'd seen there, the men and women who walked in broken and left with their backs a little straighter. That place had become more than a building. It was a pulse, a heartbeat I could still feel even from here. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, the ice clinking like tiny church bells, and leaned forward, elbows on my knees. I thought about what forgiveness really meant. People talk about it like it's some grand act, like it takes courage or holiness. But the truth is simpler. Forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about the space you clear in your own soul when you stop letting pain rent it out. It's freedom, plain and quiet. I took a sip, let the sweetness sit on my tongue, and exhaled. I'd spent so many years trying to prove something to my son, to the world, to myself. But somewhere along the way I learned that proof isn't peace. You can win the fight and still lose the lesson if you don't learn when to lay your sword down. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, brushing against the wind chimes. Rosa hung by the porch years ago. They sang a soft, uneven melody, and I hummed along, finishing her song where she left it. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. I thought of all the versions of myself that had come and gone, the mechanic with grease-stained hands, the husband who couldn't let go of pride, the father who stood outside in the cold with a suitcase and heartbreak. I buried each one of them along the way, but in their place grew something new, something stronger. People think survival is about fighting back, but sometimes it's about standing still, listening, breathing, letting time do the heavy lifting. The streetlights flickered on one by one and the night settled slow. I closed my eyes, feeling the rhythm of the world sinking with the steady beat of my own heart. I'd come a long way from that night on the curb with nowhere to go. Every wound I carried had turned into a map that led me here, to this porch, this peace, this stillness. I looked out at the horizon, the last streaks of sunlight fading like brushstrokes across the sky. My voice came out low, almost a whisper. "They thought they buried me," I said, the words carried by the wind. But I was a seed. Somewhere I imagined Rosa smiling at that, her laughter blending with the chimes, with the hum of the crickets, with the pulse of the city that never stopped breathing. And for the first time in a lifetime, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. Not forgiveness, not closure, not even tomorrow. The world could spin on without me for a while. I had done my part. I leaned back, eyes half closed, humming that same old blues tune under my breath. The stars began to appear one by one, quiet witnesses to a life that had finally come full circle. Maybe stillness wasn't the absence of noise after all. Maybe it was the sound of peace finding its home. And as the night deepened, wrapping me in its calm, I smiled to myself, knowing the truth. I'd spent a lifetime chasing some battles or won, not by fire, but by the grace of a man who learns when to stop fighting. Life has a way of humbling us, then teaching us what pride never could. Elijah's story reminds us that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's wisdom earned through pain. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in fighting back, but in letting go. When we hold on to anger, we stay trapped in the moment we were hurt. But when we forgive, we open the door to peace, dignity, and freedom. True justice doesn't always come with noise or revenge. It comes quietly through grace, patience, and faith. As we grow older, we learn that time heals most wounds, but only forgiveness heals the heart. So pour a cup of sweet tea, sit with your memories, and let stillness do its work. You might find that what felt like an ending was really the start of becoming whole again. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more powerful tales of wisdom, redemption, and family. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever found peace by forgiving someone who hurt you?